I want to talk today a little bit about one of my own teachers, Rabbi Ed Feinstein. And he was a student of another rabbi who I'd never met personally, but another big rabbi from a synagogue in Los Angeles, who wrote and published, and I was very impacted by this rabbi's writings, Rabbi Harold Schulweis. And he wrote a book called Predicate Theology. And it was all about his idea of God and what God is, and it may have actually been his thesis, his PhD thesis, I'm not sure. But it's a big work of philosophy and theology. And maybe it's also that grammar was never my strong suit, so the word predicate always confused me as well. But Predicate Theology was one of the harder books of his to understand for a rabbi that wrote and spoke in a very approachable and meaningful way. But his student, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, would tell us how he would explain it when he would walk into a class of young kids, even kindergartners. And that always helped me. And that's what I wanted to share a little bit with you today. He would ask the children when he walked into a Hebrew school class, what's the difference between a noun and a verb? And every one of the kids would usually know the answer. Right? A noun is a person, a place, or a thing. A verb is an action. It's something that we do. And then he would ask them, what is God? And kids would figure out God is verb or a noun. What is God? A noun, right? That's how we think about God. God is maybe a person or something. God is something in that person, place, or thing category, right? And then he would ask them, what can you tell me about that noun, God? And that's where the room would usually be a little harder to describe, right? What can you tell me about that person, place, or thing? It's actually appropriate, right? Because we think of God often in the Torah, we talk about God in human terms. We anthropomorphize God with an outstretched arm or God's anger and God's nostrils flared up. Right? A person. Sometimes God is the ineffable, something we can't quite express, but it's something. And even one of the names for God is Hamakom, the place. We think of God as a place. But these are all nouns. We can't really describe them. It's hard to put into words. So we would ask the students, what if God was a verb? What if God wasn't a noun? What if God was a verb? How would you describe that verb? What is godly? And they'd come up with answers. Right? It's godly to be nice to people, to visit someone who's sick, to care for someone who's hungry. Right? These are things that are godly. We can think of doctors and nurses who care so much for loved ones, who help people who devote their lives to helping people, firemen and women who run into a building to rescue someone. That's a godly act. It's a godly act. And so that was the idea of predicate theology distilled down for elementary age children. But it's a beautiful idea. We often think of God as a noun, and it's hard to describe God when God's a noun. But we know what God is, or what's godly, when God is a verb, an action. To make peace, to love people, to take care of people, to protect the world, to protect each other. These are godly things. There's another person who I've been heavily influenced through his writings, Yeshayahu Leibowitz. For those of you who don't know of him, he was an Israeli Orthodox philosopher. His day job, he was actually a chemistry professor, but he was a fairly right-wing thinker. And he expressed a fairly strict position, usually, in Jewish theology and philosophy and practice. It's actually a story about him. It said that he would go ahead, if he was in a nice mood, because he thought that you shouldn't pray because you feel good. You should pray because it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. You should only do a mitzvah because it's commanded, it's God's will, not for some hippy-dippy liberal Jewish reason of it's a nice thing to do, you like it, it feels good, or reinventing the meaning behind the rituals, but all the things I often preach about. He thought we should do a mitzvah only because we're commanded to. So it said that if he was in a good mood, it was a particularly beautiful day out in the university and the campus, and he was afraid maybe he would pray his mincha, his afternoon service, because he was happy. he would go back into his lab into the last possible moment to daven halachically the mincha, the afternoon service, and he would wait and work on a problem that was really difficult, that he was struggling with, till he was miserable and in an awful mood, and then he would pray, when he knew he was only doing it out of the sense of commandedness, not out of his own personal sense of joy. So that gives you a bit of his theology, his philosophy. And yet when reading this week's Parsha, he has an answer that fits in line with where he comes from, but I think is actually very much in line with Rabbi Schulweiss's and Rabbi Feinstein's position about God as a verb. He talks about this commandment, V'asu li mikdash, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. And he says that this phrase is divided in two. There's the first and the second half. And he says that it emphasizes not that God's going to dwell in the sanctuary, but where is God going to dwell? Amongst us. The Israelites build this mikdash, God will live among them. He says the emphasis there is on that, because it repeats it again later in Parshat Tetzaveh next week. I will dwell among the children of Israel and be their God. So the emphasis is that God doesn't dwell in the mikdash, God dwells amongst the people. But what do we do for God to dwell amongst us? For Leibowitz, it's obey God's commands. God commands you to build a sanctuary, you build it, and in the process of building it, by doing what God commands you, God will be a part of you. God will dwell among you. So it fits in with his idea, but we can take it a little bit further, I think. Because what he's saying is more or less what Rabbi Schulweiss is saying, and Rabbi Feinstein are saying. When you act godly, God dwells amongst you. That Judaism isn't about the structure of the mikdash, but people doing God's work on earth. It's actually what Rabbi Leibowitz writes, Dr. Leibowitz, he wasn't a rabbi, but Dr. Leibowitz writes, the sanctuary is not the architecture that houses the divine presence, but rather the divine dwelling in the service that Israel performs for God, right? God dwells in the actions that we do when we do God's will. The sanctuary is thus the religion and faith. The second half of the aforementioned verse is just a rephrasing of the first half. It's tautological. The two halves of that verse, he says, mean the same thing. Let them build me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. By building the sanctuary, God dwells among them. The two halves of the verse are the same exact thing, he says. By doing God's will, God dwells in that space amongst us. God dwells amongst the children of Israel, amongst the Jewish people when we act godly. So the thought I want us to take with us is in a world where every year I see headlines based off of a new study from the Pew or from another center about how Americans and Canadians and young people are becoming less interested in religion. How even older generations are falling away from tradition. How more and more people don't believe in God. I want us to think about the consequences of that. What does that mean? I think a world in which people don't believe in God is a very scary world. But I don't need people to believe in a scary God. A God is a noun that punishes people, that chooses who's going to get sick and who's not going to get sick, that if you didn't pray hard enough, maybe that's why you got the disease or the illness or your loved one died. That God I don't need. The God that people used to believe in mass, that made them feel guilty because they assumed that they'd done something wrong when something bad happened to them or someone they loved, that somehow it was their fault. That God, the noun. I think it's okay that we're falling away from belief in that. But God is a verb. The idea of godliness. The idea that something sacred exists in this universe, in this world. That there's more to life than just matter. That we're more than just computers made of flesh and bone and all of the different parts of us. That there's something deeper than that. A world where we forget that That's a dangerous and a scary world I don't want to be in. And that's where I think it's important for us to think about the distinction, to remind people that there's a different way of thinking about God. That the God that they might not believe in, that noun, is also the God that I don't believe in that sense. But the godliness, the ability to act in a holy way, the ability to carry on God's will on earth by doing mitzvot, by doing deeds of chesed, deeds of kindness, deeds of compassion, or even deeds that sometimes we don't understand. It's not kind to put up a mezuzah on our wall or to put on our talit. It's not a mitzvah in that colloquial sense of a good deed, but it's still a commandment. And that's where Dr. Leibovitz helps me. The idea that by simply doing these things, we're creating a space for God to dwell amongst us. By putting God's will before our own in those moments, I think it gives us the space and the ability to continue to act in that godly way, to live with God as a verb, to be holy presences in this world. So this Shabbat, my thought is, a suggestion for all of us is to think about how we can act godly this week. Not try to understand the unfathomable, that God is a noun, but instead try to see what it feels like to incorporate predicate theology for a week, whether you want to call it that or not. To think of God as a verb. And ask ourselves this week, what are those actions? How can we be godly? How can we create a space for God to dwell amongst us? Shabbat Shalom.